Hello everyone, this is Pastor Blake. We're continuing our study through the book of Daniel, chapter 5. So in chapter 4 we see that Daniel is just being elevated and changed, and Nebuchadnezzar went crazy for a little while. God gave him back his reason, and so now he's a little bit more humbled than he was. Not fully, he hadn't converted or anything, but certainly a little bit more humble. So now, it actually starts off, chapter 5 does, with another person, just out of the blue, Belshazzar. And so it does state that he called Nebuchadnezzar his father. Now we know that probably wasn't necessarily the case. He wasn't actually his father. It was more he was using it as a reference of authority over him. Like, he's my father, because rulers back in the day, they thought of their people as children. Well, he was more of a regent of the area. So kind of a nobleman, somewhat an authority, but not the actual king and not the actual son of the king. He actually had, his father was probably Nabonidus, if that's how you pronounce it. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, which is the Bible says. So it's interesting, though, how Belshazzar probably was in the place to actually take the ruler, the kingship, kind of after Nebuchadnezzar had his little crazy spell. After God kind of released his mind and he was, eating plants like an animal and an ox out in the field. And so Belshazzar probably got in authority and in the position to take over while Nebuchadnezzar was going through that. We know that Daniel probably helped with that because he was kind of a nobleman. He was a wise man at this point, or getting into it. But Belshazzar probably kind of resided as king kind of at the moment. And whenever that Nebuchadnezzar came back, Belshazzar just stepped back down, and Nebuchadnezzar came back up into authority. So that's probably the idea of what we're going to here. But we see that Belshazzar, he's in the kingdom. I mean, he knows what has been happening. He has been seeing all of the stuff in Daniel. And so this is not a guy that kind of had the unfortunate accident that we'll see in a minute without knowledge. He wasn't ignorant of what was going on. He would have known this. He was in the area. But it says in verse 1, it says, Belshazzar decided to hold a feast for 1,000 people. Now, 1,000 people. That's a big feast. Could you imagine the last time you've seen 1,000 people at once? Well, at a concert, an event, but he had a feast for that many people. And he commanded that the gold and the silver vessels from Jerusalem be brought out. Now, you remember in chapter 1 how whenever Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, he took some of the artifacts, some of the gold, some of the stuff, some of the lampstands, some of the things that were in the temple in Jerusalem. He brought those out and brought them and put them in his own temple, okay? So this is the cups or the vessels that we're talking about here, okay? And so Belshazzar says, hey, go get all those stuff that we brought up from Jerusalem. Go get the vessels, go get the cups, go get some of that stuff, and we're going to drink from them. Well, obviously that's not a good idea. That's like, taking something, just disrespectfully using it for your own gain. And so in verse 2, Belshazzar commanded that all the gold and the silver vessels be brought out. And while drinking from these things, how just disrespectful to the people of Israel. But, they were overthrown, so it didn't really matter to them. But just so disrespectful. And they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And these things were some of those elements. And so they decided, since we're going to be drinking from them, let's praise our own gods who we serve. And while they were praising them, such a disrespectful moment in Babylonian history, fingers of a human just appeared. Now, this would have been crazy, but, they're in a big room, and it seems to be as somewhere that all of them could see. It was in a prominent place, and the king immediately saw this. Fingers of a human hand, in verse 5, appeared and then wrote on the plaster of the wall. So just fingers appeared out of nowhere, just started writing on the wall, and everyone started freaking out. The king, it said he changed his color. He was scared. He became limp in his legs, so he kind of was almost on his way passing out. But he realized, oh my word, this is something crazy that has happened. And in verse 7, we see the king called out loudly, which is interesting, for the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. He said, whoever can tell me what this means, the interpretation, I'll cover you in purple, which was a signifying of a very expensive color of fabric in the area at that time. And then put a gold chain around his neck, which did signify a special place in the kingdom. And then on top of all of that shall be third ruler in the kingdom. So this is a big moment. Belshazzar knew, hey, I didn't believe in all this stuff. I haven't praised the God that's been dealing with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, but I need to figure out what this is. This is crazy. There's hands or fingers just show up. They had enchanters, they had magicians. We don't know what all they were capable of, but this certainly would have freaked out anyone, and it freaked out them to the point that it said their color changed. And so we see this happens, and then the queen, of all people, verse 10, the queen said, hey, but guess what? There was a guy, Daniel. You remember Daniel, how he interpreted the first dream, and then he interpreted the second dream, and then Nebuchadnezzar went crazy, and he came back to read it. Daniel probably could do this. Daniel probably knows what's going on. He probably could interpret this dream, or this thing for you, this miracle that's happening, this wonder. He said, why don't we go get Daniel and see if he could do this? He said, because none of the interpreters, the enchanters, the magicians, none of them were able to do it. And but you know what? Daniel can solve riddles. He can solve these problems. So let's go get him. And so it's interesting how at first Daniel was just the minority. He was a kind of a refugee, if you will, into this other land. He was being taken, though, and placed in this other land. He was being placed, out of his culture and everything, and he was being put in this very hard to be position, that he was having to learn things from this other culture that had just, probably killed some of the people he knew, even maybe some of his friends, And then all of a sudden, little bit by little bit, God starts elevating Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And all of a sudden, instead of Daniel seeking out help like the first dream did, and then the second dream, they're like, Daniel can do it. Now he's actually being sought after to interpret. You see how even though Daniel was in the situation he was in, God continually just elevated him over and over again. Now he is the one being sought after, not him seeking an answer to save his own life. Okay? And so they brought Daniel before the king, and it was given a slight compliment even. He said, hey, Daniel, we know that you can do this. We know that you solve problems. We know you have interpreted this. We know that you're from the exile, but you can also do this. Come and what does this mean? And so a slight compliment, even if it was a little maybe backhanded, because they said, you're one of the people that we kind of took over from Judah. So, but he was known for having the wisdom and the problem-solving interpretation. So verse 17, it says, Daniel starts off by refusing the gifts offered. Let your gifts be for yourself and give your reward to another. Now, this was a pretty good gift. All three of these, fine, super fine fabric that would have been very expensive, a gold chain that represented authority and wealth, and then to be third in the kingdom itself. Now, this is the biggest kingdom of the time. Remember that. This is the gold head from the first statue dream. That was a good place to be in. But Daniel said, you know what? Let your gifts be for yourself. Give it to another. Because you see, Daniel not only growing up through this culture now, through the 3 years, the training program he was in, not wanting to eat the king's food. You see, Daniel decided to separate himself from the culture. And even though he was being elevated, Daniel still knew that he couldn't just jump into the system just because God gave him favor. He's still, just like in the beginning, separating himself from the food, separating himself from, some of the other things of the kingdom. He needed to keep himself still separate from all of this fame and glory, because he knew all of this was only because of God. He knew that God had led the children of Israel into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. He knew that God was the one giving the dreams, and he was being given the interpretations. And so Daniel kept himself from being too high and mighty. He kept himself serving the true and one and only God. And so we continue to read. And 18 through 21, Daniel says the writing mean that God will bring up and tear down whom he wills. He kind of expounds on it. It's kind of interesting. He talks about he was... when his heart, Nebuchadnezzar's heart, was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he might dwell proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of man. And it goes on to say, the Most High rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he wills. He can do whatever he wants. The God that he serves brings up kingdoms and he puts down kingdoms. We continue to read in verse 22. And his son Belshazzar have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven and the vessels of his house and brought in before you. You see, the thing is, Daniel makes kind of make a statement that really helps us understand the situation. What I was telling you earlier, he says, you know what? You knew of this. You knew that our God that I serve was actually making all of this happen. And you knew that, I mean, if God made all this happen, you probably shouldn't take the stuff that you took from his temple and just disgracingly drink from it. And so Daniel's making the statement, look, you knew this. You saw what was happening. And so, but yet you still decided to dishonor God. And so now the judgment's on you. It's not on Nebuchadnezzar anymore. Nebuchadnezzar started to learn, but now Belshazzar, you are about to learn. And so, verse 23, Daniel states that they drank from the cups which were in the temple and were dishonoring to God. He said, and for that reason, the inscription was, who knows how to actually say it, but something like Mene, Tekele, and Parsin. It was just 4 words. 2 that were repeated at the beginning, which we know always means it's very significant. Okay, if anything ever repeated in the Bible, instead of using exclamation marks or stuff, they would just repeat what they were going to say. So we know this is very significant. And we know that, and he goes on to say, Mene means God has numbered the days of his kingdom. And as we just said, if it's repeated, that means it's probably going to happen very quickly. You have been numbered, and these numbers are not even long. Like, this is going to happen very quickly. Tekele, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Because, look, everyone is judged for their own selves. No one's going to be standing right next to you on that judgment day in the throne room saying, well, I mean, he saw like the good I did, and he thought I was a real cool guy. No, you're going to be judged yourself. And just like this, God judged Belshazzar. And it said he was found wanting. He did not live up to the potential that God had for even him. And also remembering that Belshazzar knew all this stuff that was happening to Nebuchadnezzar. So God really gave him a chance to change his life, to turn around his life. God gave him a chance not to make the same mistakes. But he was found wanting. He was still making some of the disrespectful, dishonoring mistakes that Nebuchadnezzar was making. And then the last one, it says, it kind of translates it into Perez. Now Perez we know is singular for parson, so that's why you see 2 different words there. But Perez, it's his kingdom is divided and will be given to the Medes and the Persians. And so we see this as your days are numbered. You have been judged. You have not been found good. You have been found wanting. You have missed the mark. And so your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Very specific. Now we do know, reading through commentaries, I saw a lot of suggested that the words were Aramaic. We know that. And it translates kind of roughly into numbered, weighed, divided. So Mene, Telek, and Parsin. Numbered, weighed, and divided. And so you see how this was a progression. But, so there was given a suggestion in the commentary that they actually could have known what the word said. They may have realized, oh, it says numbered, weighed, divided. What does that even mean? But the problem was not necessarily what it said. They asked Daniel, could you interpret this for us? So there was a possibility they actually knew what the words meant, just simply needed to know knew what the words was, but needed to know what the words actually meant. And so, and Belshazzar seemed to accept that. Now, obviously, that wouldn't have been a good thing to say to one of the regents, the rulers in the area. But it terrified him enough, struck fear into him. It said, his face changed. And so it seemed like some of this fear was, also accepted. It's like, you know what? Fine then. I guess that's it. And we see, though, Belshazzar is true to his word. And so he commands to give honor to Daniel. And Daniel was clothed in a purple robe. He was put a gold chain around his neck. He's made third in the kingdom, even though he actually didn't ask for it. And then verse 30, that very night, remember Mene, the importance, numbered, it seems like it was going to happen very quickly, this interpretation. That very night, the interpretation came true. Belshazzar was killed. Okay, Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Mede took over control of the kingdom, or at least his area, or something. We're going to learn more about that. But this is pretty wild. Daniel was being elevated, and he was being, finally sought after, and people weren't just asking for people or commanding people to do this interpretation. They said, you know what? The queen knew. He's like, hey, get Daniel. Daniel can do this. But the whole time, you know what? Give your reward to another person. Keep it for yourself. Daniel still kept his dedication to God. He still kept himself, trying to keep himself distant from just accepting just into this lifestyle and this culture. Daniel decided to follow God, even though his culture, even though God was even elevating himself, but he stayed true to what God had for him. Daniel knew he had to follow the Lord. And so, what do we see? Daniel just doing what God allowed him to do. God allowed him to have interpretation, the ability to do that, and so he did that. Now, everyone in the kingdom still learning, man, this Daniel guy, this God that he serves, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had their fiery furnace moment. They came out unscathed, not smelling. Everyone in the kingdom was starting to realize this God of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is serious. So tune in next week to find out more. Chapter 6. Goodbye.